on that basis, we have three skeletal muscle fiber types: slow oxidative on one end, fast glycolytic on the other end, and then somewhere in the middle, we have fast oxidative, which is kind of an intermediary. The rate is fast, but the mechanism of ATP is oxidative. So it's kind of right in the middle of both of those fiber types. So let's discuss the properties of each of these. So the properties of slow oxidative fibers. These are on the slow end of the spectrum. Think your long distance runner here. Low myosin ATPase activity, so that means they contract slower, they also relax slower. Lots of mitochondria, lots of rich blood supply, lots of myoglobin, the storage of that ATP, and then smaller diameter, smaller amount of force or tension produced, and then a smaller diffusion barrier because of that smaller diameter. And then because they have the ability to maintain oxidative phosphorylation, they are going to fatigue much slower. You can power these for a longer duration. Way on the other end of our spectrum, fast glycolytic. So these are your bodybuilder's type of muscle, right? The biceps of a bodybuilder, for example. High myosin ATPase activity, high glycolytic capacity. So the ability to store lots of glycogen, but also lots of the glycolytic enzymes to carry out glycolysis. They appear white because they have no myoglobin. So they don't have to store ATP. They don't have to have lots of mitochondria, and so they don't have myoglobin, excuse me. They also have a large diameter because they don't need that diffusion barrier. And then because of that large diameter, they can generate much more force. And just to make the connection here, remember the diameter of the muscle dictates the force production, the tension production, because now we have more myofibrils in that muscle fiber, and we simply have more cross-bridge cycling, which can power more tension, more force, which is more contraction, right? But the price to pay, again, lactate, and so these can fatigue pretty quickly. Now, somewhere in the middle here is our fast oxidative. So they're not entirely fast as fast glycolytic, and they're not entirely slow as slow oxidative. So they have an intermediate myosin ATPase activity. They have a high oxidative capacity because they are oxidative in terms of their last name, right? The second name of the fiber. But they are still going to be a little bit slower to fatigue than our fast glycolytic fibers, if that makes sense. So they're not as quick to fatigue as fast glycolytic. So they are slow to fatigue, but more rapidly than the slow oxidative fibers, and not as fast as the fast glycolytic fibers. And then the diameter is also going to be somewhere in the middle in terms of not as small as slow oxidative and not as big as fast glycolytic. And then here's a nice summary table, again, really helpful to help you identify the features of each of these, the slow end, the fast end, and then the intermediate. And then think about how their properties differ, especially as it pertains to the histology, okay? Now, in terms of looking at the examples in everyday life, we can think about dark meat versus white meat. If you think of the analogy when we think about food, for example, or parts of animals, for example, the breast part of animals will typically have more glycolytic fibers, more white fibers. We typically refer to this as being white meat, versus the thigh and leg, the lower parts of animals will typically be associated as dark. And if you think about the types of activities, right? If you look at birds, for example, they have to do lots of flying. So their wings and breasts are going to be fast glycolytic types of fibers. They do less walking, right? So their lower parts of their body will have more of that, the dark, which is the slow oxidative. So we can make that analogy when it comes to parts of our body, parts of animals as well. Now let's think about the responses to these fiber types when it comes to exercise. So each of these is going to have a mixture, as I mentioned. They won't be entirely all or nothing, but they'll be predominantly one or the other. And then the properties will be determined on the type of activity that that muscle is usually used for. So we can sort of condition our muscles to have more fast oxidative or more fast glycolytic, excuse me, or more slow oxidative. And an example of this is our postural muscles. So muscles like your erector spinae muscles of the back, right? Your soleus muscle of the calf and legs. Those are going to have more slow oxidative fibers. They keep your posture upright all day without you even thinking about it or, working very hard versus more of your powerful contractors, your biceps, your triceps, your quads, your hamstrings. Those are going to be more of your fast glycolytic, especially again, if you're an athlete, those are going to be more conditioned to rely on glycolysis, right? Now, when you think about a single motor unit, the fibers will typically be all of the same, but then within the entire muscle, the fibers will usually be mixed, right? So one motor unit must have all of the same fiber types, but then a different motor unit can have different fiber types associated. And then the recruitment principle is going to apply here as well. The recruitment order will be slow oxidative first because these fibers are smaller in diameter. They're easy to sort of stimulate or to contract. Then fast oxidative, which are in the middle, and then fast glycolytic, which are at the very end. They're going to be the last to recruit because these fibers are thicker in diameter. It's going to take much more calcium, much more ATP to power these bigger, thicker muscles than it does to power smaller muscles. So that is the recruitment order. The size principle will follow here as well in terms of the fiber type. We also want to think about the resistance to fatigue, and this will differ depending on the type of activity. So with high intensity activities, we're going to think about the reasons for fatigue here being because of the glycolytic fibers. The buildup of lactate is also going to be responsible for fatigue. The strength of the contraction, so because the muscle, the fiber diameter is larger and the contraction is more forceful, the strength of these contractions can actually compress the blood vessels, and that can be another reason that we see fatigue more quickly with these types of activities and these types of muscles. Another reason is the neuromuscular fatigue. So we can see depletion of acetylcholine that's responsible for the synaptic transmission at the neuromuscular junction, and so that can be responsible for fatigue as well. And then another reason is the altered enzyme activity. The altered enzyme activity. So because of the buildup of lactate, that creates an acidic environment, lactic acid creating that acidity within the muscle environment. So that can actually alter or denature sometimes the enzymes and their enzymatic activity, and that can be another reason for fatigue. The fatigue here is going to be recovered, however, in minutes to hours. So if you went to the gym, let's say, for example, you had a really ambitious session where you lifted weights that were a little bit too heavy, it's going to take you a quicker amount of time to recover from that. Within minutes to hours, your muscle will typically go back to their resting state. You may still have some soreness the day after, but in terms of the lactic acid and the burn in the muscle, that will usually recover almost immediately. Now, contrasting that to low intensity activities like jogging, long distance running, the reasons for fatigue here are depletion of the energy reserves. So think about your Olympic marathon runners. They have to keep their glycogen stores going in order to keep them from, becoming fatigued or enable them to complete their race. So the reason for fatigue with these low intensity exercise is not really lactic acid because we don't have that here. It's not really the neuromuscular depletion, but it's just having the overall store to power oxidative phosphorylation, the glycogen stores in order to keep the contraction going. But this will also take a much longer time to recover. So when those marathon runners are done, they're done for about a week, right? It takes them a couple days to recover, for their muscles to get back to their original conditioning, and for them to even be able to think about running another marathon, right? So they're going to take a much longer duration to recover. And then the other component here is the psychological fatigue. We want to think about how psychology can play a part in muscle function and muscle contraction. And with this plays a part in athletes. Their psychology is extremely important. This is why a lot of coaches have to do some, psychological training, some mental conditioning, if you will, because usually if you're at the brink of fatigue, you can sometimes have this psychological push, this drive, if you will, that comes in from parts of your brain, like your amygdala, your hippocampus, that just kind of power you through, even in states when your muscles are physically fatigued. So the psychology can play a role in sort of overriding your physical limitations and giving you enough sort of gusto, if you will, to power through contractions when you're towards the end of that spectrum in terms of the strength. right? So that must be taken into account when we think about fatigue, especially with low intensity exercises as well. Now, when we think about what fatigue looks like, so fatigue, if you look at the normal contraction, we can stimulate the muscle, it can contract and then relax. If we stimulate it a second time, we can get the same amount of tension produced and then an equal time between relaxation. We can stimulate the muscle again, and as we can see, this can happen ongoing, right? This can happen subsequent, contractions based upon subsequent stimuli, and that will power the contractions with the same duration without any drop in the amount of tension that can be produced. Now, so this is normal muscle. Now, this is what fatigue begins to look like. There comes a time where as you stimulate that muscle, it no longer is able to generate that same maximum tension that it once could produce. So this is where the muscle begins to fatigue. So again, at the end of an Olympic race, a marathon runner is no longer able to produce the same amount of tension to power their muscles as they could at the beginning of the race. And so that is what fatigue looks like. Another way that we can see fatigue is after maximum static contraction. So let's say you have maxed out the force that this muscle can produce, and you gave the muscle a resting period. Fatigue shows up in that the next time you stimulate the muscle, it cannot generate the same amount of force that it did for that initial contraction, which again tells us that the muscle is not back to its original state or its resting state of conditioning, right, or of contraction. And so what this looks like in sort of everyday terms is that Olympic runner runs his race, they rest for a week, they try to run that same race again a week later, and they just cannot finish it, right? Because that is still fatigue. The muscles are still undergoing their resting period, and they're not back to their original conditioning. And so it'll probably take months for that runner to be able to prepare and run for a subsequent race. Okay, just to give an example. Now let's think about long-term responses to muscles and different types of exercises, and we can compare aerobic exercises to high-intensity exercises. So we think about, again, our marathon runner here, our long-distance runner here, having increased oxidative capacity. Now they can have some fast glycolytic fibers that can be converted to fast oxidative fibers. And so that can shift the metabolic reliance of the muscles. Instead of relying on glycolysis, they can now be reliant on oxidative. However, you cannot change a fast muscle into a slow muscle. You can change its main source of ATP, but a fast muscle is a fast muscle and a slow muscle is a slow muscle. So you cannot condition your muscle to become fast versus slow, but you can condition it to require oxidation versus glycolysis. Another effect that we see with aerobic activities would be increasing the size and number of mitochondria, decrease in the fiber diameter, so the fibers get smaller. This is why long distance runners are usually much more lean as opposed to bulkier muscles or thicker muscles. And then increasing the number of capillaries that are actually surrounding the muscle. So lots of capillaries will help to deliver that oxygen. With high intensity activities, the opposite here, think about your bodybuilder. The conditioning here is decreasing oxidative capacity. We can convert those fast oxidative fibers to become fast glycolytic, but again, we cannot make a fast fiber into a slow fiber or slow fiber into a fast fiber. And then we can decrease the size and number of mitochondria, increase the fiber diameter, which is why when you start weightlifting, the muscle literally physically gets bigger. And then we reduce the resistance to fatigue. So that means it's going to be fatigued much quicker because of lactate. Now, I want to point out here, this is extremely helpful when we think about the aerobic activities. This is why it's so important to think about the heart health, because high intensity activities, while they're great for powering big muscles and fast, strong contractions, they're actually not helpful or friendly to your heart. Aerobic types of activities, which increase capillaries, increase blood flow, increase oxygenation, that's much more helpful, much more heart friendly. And so when you think about the types of activities that your doctor might recommend to increase your heart health, it's going to be more of aerobic activities like walking, like swimming, like jogging, lighter intensity activities that actually strengthen your blood vessels, strengthen your cardiovascular system on a whole, and is much more friendly on your heart. than high intensity activities where you eliminate capillaries. So now your heart is sort of under a higher strain, higher stress to oxygenate your body with a limited number of blood vessels. And so that can be less sustainable in terms of, keeping you healthy, keeping you fit to have a long, healthy life. So just to give you a little bit of insight on why aerobic activities are more friendly in terms of longevity, in terms of heart health, in terms of just aging well, as well. Now we can also think about how muscles would atrophy if you don't use them. So if you don't use it, you lose it, right? This use atrophy. This is happening with certain neuromuscular dystrophies. Let's say you have one of the myopathies where your muscles are not being innervated properly, a peripheral nerve disorder. That can lead to the muscles losing their excitation, their stimulation, and then they simply get smaller and get weaker. And that is because a decrease in size of the myofibrils. So there's less myofibrils in the muscle. It literally gets smaller, and then it also becomes weaker. It's not as able to generate as much force as it would if it were bigger.